Welcome to Green Time. I'm host Don Fitz. We're going to be talking this episode about racism and drug law enforcement. And with me I have Kenny Murdock from the WGNU 920, the Murdock Report. I got that right?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Fantastic. And I have John Payne with Show-Me Cannabis. Now I want to just ask both of you, do you think that there's any sort of racial disparity or intentional racism in the enforcement of drug laws, especially marijuana laws?
The short answer for me is definitely yes. But I want people to think of it this way. The war on drugs is not just now racist. It has been racist since its inception. Part of the reason why cannabis was called marijuana is that it was easier to pass and make it illegal when you said it made it sound like it was Mexican and that black jazz musicians would be using it, and it was done to scare the public and scare elected officials. It was a lobbyist trick. Over time, that
was in the 1930s,
That was in the 1930s. And over time, we've had new strategies towards controlling it, from just eradication to Nixon strategies in the war on drugs. And I invite your audience to do your own homework on looking at what Nixon said about the war on drugs. It was supposed to have another aspect to it, and that is controlling the black population.
And it is very interesting that before 1930, people didn't really think that much about smoking marijuana. You might smoke marijuana, you might not smoke marijuana, but then it became a horrible thing.
That's why they called it marijuana instead of hemp. It would never have passed.
There were two sort of different ways that people thought about cannabis, actually, and that there was cannabis that many white people used and that was available in every pharmacy in this country. And you can go back and look at advertisements in magazines like Sears and Roebuck or any basically mail order catalog you can think of from the 20s or teens, and you can find cannabis indica or cannabis sativa tinctures that you could order freely. But then there was something that they thought was different. It wasn't, but that was marijuana, and that was being used by Mexican immigrants and black jazz musicians, and those were the people that were considered dangerous. And so it wasn't the substance that was actually they really thought was dangerous. It was the people that were using it. And so that was really what they were seeking to criminalize.
Yeah, well, one thing that was interesting to me when I didn't think about it until years later, I grew up in the 1950s, and so that was only about 20 years after the criminalization of marijuana. And so when I was taking Spanish, when I was 8 or 9 years old in elementary school, one of the songs we learned how to sing was La Cucaracha. Right. Which is the cockroach. The cockroach. He can't travel because he doesn't have his marijuana to smoke. And it's like the full paranoia about marijuana had not fully sunk in even 20 years after the criminalization. Now let me ask you this. A lot of people, the events of Ferguson is on the mind not just of people in St. Louis and Ferguson, but people throughout the United States. Is there a difference? Would young black men have different attitudes towards the police as a result of the way that they're treated for marijuana and other drug offenses?
I think the way marijuana is enforced in America has created paranoia in the young black community. But there's also another side of it. One of the sad statistics that is true about African American men is that from age 18 to 35, the number one cause of death for black men is homicide. Part of that is because there's a lot of violence in the war on drugs. Once you made cannabis illegal, it pushed it into the black market. And there's a lot of violence in protecting turf areas with guns and gang wars in the black market. Making it legal might break all of that control bad criminal gangs have over it and bring it into regulation and to state-run agencies.
Well, that certainly happened with alcohol. I mean, if you watch, when I was in high school, I used to watch The Untouchables.
Elliot Ness and The Untouchables.
And he would shoot everybody up. But I mean, there's not very many people who shoot each other for beer wars today. I mean, you just don't.
Miller and Anheuser-Busch are not sending people with Tommy guns to shoot each other's breweries up. It doesn't happen anymore.
Right. So does it seem like there is an over-militarization of the war on cannabis?
Yes, absolutely. And the war on drugs has really been what has driven police militarization in the United States. There have been other factors, of course, but really starting in the 1980s and 1990s, police agencies were able to apply for military surplus equipment that they said was necessary to fight the war on drugs, because they made arguments that drug dealers were as well armed, if not more well armed, than the police. And so because of that, they started having things like armored personnel carriers and MRAPs and SWAT teams in cities of 5 to 10,000 people that are executing all their search warrants now, sometimes for things as as run-of-the-mill as a few ounces of marijuana, that they are using military equipment and a battering ram to stop somebody from possessing a few joints. Even if you think marijuana should be illegal, this seems like overkill at the very least.
Do you think that the black community is disproportionately the victim of this super militarization of drug wars?
Yes, since black people and white people and all actually ethnic identities use cannabis or use drugs about the same rates, it is disproportional enforcement. In the city of St. Louis, I've heard police officers tell me that it's 18 times more probable for a young black man to be arrested or stopped for cannabis. 18 times more probable. 18 to 1 is the ratio. This leads to systemic problems, not just if they get caught and they get either their ticket, or it's the harassment, it's a continuous war on drugs. It often feels like a war on young black men, especially when the economic upsprings from our society don't always trickle down to those areas that are impoverished. So social mobility becomes hard. So you have a lot of young black men that think, well, maybe I should get into the drug market because at least it will be some way to make some money. This is an old trap that leads to the prison complex, and it leads to people dropping out of schools and making more problems for the black community.
Well, what does it do to somebody's job opportunities if you have to put in a job application that you've been
If you've been arrested for marijuana possession, you've almost put yourself in such a position that you're not going to be able to get a job. You can't get certain Pell Grant loans.
So if you want to go to community college,
if you want to go to college, you want to pay for higher education, you cannot get loans for higher education if you have a marijuana arrest on your record. And it's a shame because maybe someone who wanted to change their life around is the exact type of person we want to go and matriculate through higher education. But instead, we continuously and lifelong penalize people for marijuana possession. Also, one thing that people might not know about Missouri, specifically in marijuana, is Missouri is one state that has a person locked up in marijuana for the rest of their life. This is
that's amazing.
And this person, by the name of Jeff Mazansky, he's in for marijuana possession, nonviolent offender. He has seen murderers and rapers leave jail and come back to jail, and he has still been in jail for some 20 years.
That is amazing that somebody could be in jail for a long period of time.
For life.
For life, for a drug, which is fairly innocuous. And according to when I teach about marijuana in introductory psychology, I always say marijuana is sort of like coffee, in the sense that there are people who have psychotic reactions to coffee and marijuana. It's not a zero danger drug, just like coffee's not a zero danger, but neither one of them is at all comparable to something really serious like alcohol and cigarettes. Okay, let's take a break. We're going to look at a brief movie. I want to mention this movie. The person says just for a few seconds that he is running for office, but this is actually an election which is over and past. But we want to use this because he does such a good job of rapping about marijuana.
Hi, I'm Brennan for Normal, and for the first time since 1937, more than 50% of Americans support the full legalization of marijuana. That's more Americans for it than opposed to it. I'm all about it, and I think that we should get the cops back doing real crime work and get the pot users out of jail. I'm that plant that grows around the globe. On every continent I'm harvested and then I'm sold. The seed of consciousness that help a person find his soul. My use is timeless, you can check, my history is old. My history is old. I have beginnings with ancient men and women, magicians and spirit seers with Muslims, Jews and Christians. Indian shamans gave me the name Ganja, the preside to Shiva, key to achieving Siddhana. Later, the Mexicanos call me marijuana. My reach is universal. I help people get beyond the limitations of mine. I'm beneficial to your body. They label me a demon when I'm healthier than broccoli. Forget your prohibition. You can never ever stop me. My followers will fight for me. My champions will lobby. So put your lighters up. Put your lighters up and smoke with me, cause we about to get high up. Yeah. For more information, you can go to normal.org. That's NORML.org.
Welcome back to Green Time. I'm host Don Fitz. We're talking about racism in drug law enforcement, and with me I have John Payne with Show-Me Cannabis, and I have Kenny Murdock with WGNU 920, the Murdock Report. Now, I did want to ask you, what has the effect of the drug wars and cannabis prohibition specifically, how's that affected other countries? If we read in the news, it's almost always like, well, this is what happens in the U.S., and there's really no concern about any place else.
Well, that's sort of true that Americans often don't really have that much concern about what happens in the rest of the world a lot of the time. But there are some fairly serious consequences, and the term drug war is becoming more literal in this country all the time. But it is very literal and very real in a lot of other countries, and in particular in Mexico. A lot of people don't realize this, but there have been more people killed in Mexico in the last few years than there have been in Afghanistan, which is a quite literal war zone. And so
more people killed in Mexico than Afghanistan.
Yes.
That is astounding.
And I believe it was about 60,000 people killed in Mexico between 2010 and 2013. And that's and primarily not deep inside Mexico, right on the northern border of Mexico, very close to where the border with the United States is. And this is almost all attributable to the drug trade, people that are fighting over control of the drug routes coming into the United States. And about the estimates vary about how much of this is about cannabis, but it ranges from about 30 to 60% depending on who you ask.
So a huge proportion of the illegal drugs coming into the United States are cannabis, and that could be dealt with by ending prohibition, right, much as alcohol prohibition was ended,
right,
and the violence of shooting people for territory just
to further clarify that same point. One thing ending the prohibition would do would be break one of the main cash cows for the big drug cartels. They still use marijuana to make a lot of money. They still use cannabis in all their trades to make them more money. If we take that out of their hands, we fracture one of their economic power bases. Another side effect of the war on drugs, and especially the war on marijuana, is that it creates a police department and creates law enforcement feeling kind of like a gang themselves, that they have tools like civil asset forfeiture that they need to protect and things like that, and it makes them other the communities. Civil asset forfeiture.
What is civil
It's when a police officer can suspect that a property is in the commission of a crime. So if you're driving down the street and you have enough money in your car to buy a new car, like a few $1,000s, the police officer can assume that that money's in a drug deal, take the money and not charge you with anything, but charge that money with the crime of suspect. Now, since it's money...
Do you get the money back?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
You want to...
Sure. So what will happen is that the money will literally be charged with the crime, and you can go to court to fight it out about this. But the thing is that there's since they're charging the money, it does not have the same sort of constitutional rights that a person has. And so once you're in court, you don't have a right to an attorney. The burden of proof that the government has is that they have to prove with a preponderance of the evidence instead of beyond a reasonable doubt as they would in a criminal case. And so when you're talking about something like a few $1,000s, most people find it easier to just not bother with it, because hiring an attorney and fighting for that, well, you're going to blow right through that few $1,000s in that process. And actually, there was a fairly famous case a few years ago in a town called Tenaha, Texas, and it's between, I believe, Houston and New Orleans. And there was a lot of people driving between there, and there's primarily African American motorists that were getting pulled over and pretty much literally shook down. They would get $20, $50, $100 taken from them by the police, who would say, well, whatever money you have on you, we think it's being used in the drug trade.
Oh, really? And so that money could be seized?
Yes, and it was.
Okay, and there, one of the things which is interesting, I don't know exactly what the statistics are, but I know that there's an enormous difference in assets between black and white families. That the discrepancy in wages is much, much less than what it used to be, but the discrepancy in assets is I think it's something like 20 to 1.
Yeah, the average African American household income value is only around $15,000. That may even be high. Whereas for non-African Americans, for white citizens, it's well within the $23,000 to $30,000.
And so if a person with lower less economic assets has $1,000 seized, that's going to hurt that person's
Greater
not going
impact.
to be able to
Much greater impact.
get money from other sources.
Yeah, another thing I invite your viewers to understand is that poverty and racism are both victims of the war on crime. It's a war on drugs. It is a manifestation we've done ourselves in society, but it hurts not just people of color, it also hurts people who want to maybe move up the social ladder or start off poor. In this time now that we're really dealing with income inequality of America, our current war on drugs is just the wrong paradigm to use towards marijuana.
Okay, well, now let me ask you, in line with that, how have views about marijuana changed over the last few decades? I know first in the 1930s there was almost no concern with marijuana. With that legislation, it increased from the 30s through, I guess, the 60s. But what's happened since the 1970s with attitudes?
I think it's really changed quite a lot. When you go back in time, it was especially when you're dealing with the original criminalization of it, it was viewed primarily through these identity lenses. And so it was, you go back and look at the first head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Harry Anslinger, when he was testifying about why we should criminalize cannabis in the first place, he would say things like, marijuana makes darkies think that they're as good as white men. And so it was,
really?
yes.
Yeah,
I mean, it's just overtly racist,
quote,
and they didn't hide what they were trying to do. They were very much on the nose about it. And then you go forward to the 60s, and you can listen to Richard Nixon in his tapes. And now it wasn't public at the time, but it's public now. And he'll talk about how it's all the people that want to legalize marijuana are all Jews and gays, and it's also people that are and liberals and communists and the hippies. And so again, it's people that were sort of considered outside the mainstream of American society. And I think that's that's changed a lot in the last 20 years. I think especially now that so many states have medical marijuana laws, a lot of people are starting to see this as a medicine.
Let me ask you this. Views have changed in the last few years, but still the arrest rate is very high. Why would the arrest rate be high if more and more of the public is tolerant of marijuana?
Well, we still misincentivize some of our prisons. We have a industrial prison complex that almost promises this, extracts promises from states saying that, hey, if we're going to build this prison, make sure you fill it. And states sign on to those agreements. So there is a misincentive in that it's profitable to put people in jail currently. And the war on drugs is one of the best ways to pay off that profitability.
So if I were in a small town with a big prison, it would ruin the economics of the town for that prison to be emptied out.
Yes.
And that's a serious social problem. Let's take a break and we'll come back to a final discussion in just a couple of minutes.
Well, I've got one more that if there aren't any. So the question, why haven't prices collapsed already if they would after legalization? And the answer is, if you try to grow multiple hundred pounds now, you are still at risk of enforcement not only from the DEA, but also from your state and local police, no matter what state you are in. And that forces you to pay your employees more. It's common, if you look at the books of marijuana suppliers, for unskilled labor to be paid $40 an hour, which is 4 times the going rate for agricultural labor. You tend to do things in inconvenient and awkward ways, like growing in small spaces and doing the processing in batch rather than continuous fashion. This isn't marijuana, but a lovely example I like to use to explain these structural consequences of product illegality is that crack dealers hiring people to pack crack vials with crack can get about 100 vials filled per hour from a high productivity worker. Those little sugar packets of sugar that you see at a restaurant, the machines that fill those do 1,000 per minute. So when it's illegal and you do things in inconvenient ways, 100 per hour. When you can bring some automation to bear on it, 1,000 per minute. There's enormous benefits that come from bringing sort of industrial approaches to manufacturing anything, including substances that are now legally drugs.
With time, this is going to be the last question. This person's asking, what are the social costs, in terms of health, crime, and law enforcement of marijuana compared to alcohol? I was hoping I addressed this a little bit. during the presentation, in that we know that heavy marijuana use in some individuals can become dependent. This can cause problems for them and their families. Not everyone, but there are some individuals that do end up having health problems because of their marijuana use. We know that it's that there can be consequences for some individuals. But if you're just looking at a heavy marijuana user versus a heavy alcohol user, there are many more social costs associated with heavy alcohol use, with respect to traffic, with respect to traffic crashes, mortality, in terms of violence. And so that's not to say that heavy marijuana use does not have consequences. In fact, we have a whole chapter on the book where we talk about all this. And that kind of gets to one of the bigger points I want to make, is that, and this is something that Rosalie alluded to, for so much of this stuff, does marijuana use, how does it influence schizophrenia, drug driving, for all these things that get put out there kind of in these debates, both sides of the issue can pull studies that say something that supports their issue. I mean, there's enough of a literature out there to where that's going to happen. But what's important to realize is just because you have one study that says this and another study saying the opposite point, it doesn't mean we should just throw up our hands and say we don't know. In some cases, this study is just better than that one. And that's why you have to actually, when you're looking at this, you actually have to focus on meta-analyses, which actually try to collect all the information from all these studies and actually try to say, okay, of these studies we have, here are the ones with the good results, here are the ones that we believe. So that's one of the things we do in the book. We have a whole chapter where we kind of look at the meta-analyses that have been done on all these different questions. How does marijuana use influence employment, education, and try to really say, here's what the science says and here's what it doesn't.
And the science is changing and how we measure it. DUI is a good example, and we had been relying on urine testing until the 2007 national survey, and now we're moving to blood analysis, which is a better indicator of whether or not the driver was actually impaired at the time of driving. So science is evolving as well. Potency is changing. So the effects of marijuana consumption and a low-grade potency marijuana, the health effects could be considerably different than that of a high potency, particularly if CBD, the offsetting psychotic element of it, is being lowered. So we're only now coming to understand some of these important things that I think will help the science ask questions better and get clearer answers going forward.
With that, we're going to be around for a few more minutes, but thank you very much for being here.
Welcome back to Green Time. I'm host Don Fitz. With me, I have a couple of people who know a lot about racism in drug law enforcement. I have John Payne with Show-Me Cannabis, and I have Kenny Murdock with WGNU 920, the Murdock Report. Now, John, is there something that you would like to leave the viewers with?
Absolutely. I would encourage the viewers to get involved and help us in the prohibition on cannabis. We hope to do that in 2016. We want to have an initiative petition out there to legalize cannabis, and they can find out more by going to our website, which is me, cannabis, CANNABIS.
Is there any hyphens in there? Or?
There is, but you can do it without it as well. We have a couple different domains.
Google is good these days,
yes.
So it'll bring it up. And so basically, people can get involved whether they're concerned about cannabis because of the racism, whether they're concerned about the medical, that they know somebody who's very ill, or they themselves could be ill and really need the marijuana. And whatever, they could go there. Okay.
Absolutely.
Kenny Murdock, what points would you like to leave the viewer with?
I would like the viewers, I invite you to activism. This is going to be a topic that's going to be discussed in the Missouri legislature this year. Whether or not Missouri wants to legalize hemp, whether or not Missouri wants to do things like medical cannabis programs, or full legalization. The Secretary of State's office has already received a petition from the Show-Me Cannabis group to work towards legalization on the 2016 ballot. So now's the time for activism, and I invite people to activism, because the war on drugs is not just a war on one class of people. It harms all of America by pulling our resources to a war that wasn't really well thought out.
And so basically what we're saying is that the war on cannabis and part of the war on drugs is something that hurts all of us. I want to thank Kenny Murdock. I want to thank John Payne, both of y'all, for coming for a great discussion. I want to thank our viewers for tuning in, and be sure to look at Green Time the same time next week.